Probably do it off the cuff. Anyway, hi, welcome to the Strand. I'm Jessica Strand, the events manager here, and I'm no relation to the Bass family that owns this store. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Bob Seidman and Judith Thurman. Bob is here this evening with his new novel, Moments Captured, based loosely on the work and life of pioneering 19th century photographer Eadweard Muybridge. I keep calling you Robert in this, so I will be formal. Robert has written two other novels, One Smart Indian and Bucks County Idol. With Don Gifford, he co-authored Ulysses Annotated. He has also written and co-written films about Wallace Stevens, Samuel Beckett, and Margaret Mead. Other scripts include Emmy-nominated A Life Apart, Hasidism in America, and In Our Time. This evening, Robert will read first from his novel, and then he will talk with Judith Thurman. And Judith Thurman is a staff writer for The New Yorker since 2000. Judith writes about fashion and books, most recently on Margaret Fuller, terrific piece. She has written Isaac Dinesen, A Life of a Story, which won the National Book Award for nonfiction, and Secrets of the Flesh, A Life of Colette. A collection of her New Yorker essays entitled Cleopatra's Nose was published in 2007. So please join me in welcoming Bob Seidman first, who will read, and then he will be in conversation with Judith, as I said, and then they will take some questions. And then we'll eat roast beef on the second floor. No, just kidding. Thank you.
We're going to show some pictures with this, too, because this is an intensely visual novel, and of course it deals with a photographer, the great Eadweard Muybridge. That is a panorama of San Francisco, which Muybridge put together by moving the camera around in a 360-degree circle. There's a modern book named, can't remember, which does a reversible panorama. Muybridge is in the 1870s. Did we lose the picture? I'm sure it'll be back. There it is. Muybridge is in the 1870s, and a modern photographer whose name I don't know. Hi, Barbara. Anyhow, this was very unique to have the ability to look at an urban place like this. No one had done it before, as far as I know. Although it's pretty simple. You need a big hill, which you have enough of in San Francisco, obviously. Muybridge seems to be having a moment. I don't know if you saw any of the telecasts of the Olympics in London in 2012. We have three friends here from London. Can we have a light up here? Is that, I can, for the moment I don't need it, but eventually I will. You may have noticed the stop time photographs, film footage of divers, say, leaping off a high board or from the springboard or from the platform. And in the NBC broadcast, they had 4 stop action poses of these men and women diving. The first being the exit from the board or the platform, the second being the tuck or the twist, the third being the recovery of the body, and the fourth, of course, the all-important splash or no splash when you enter the water. So that's all Muybridge. That certainly was, one of his innovations, the ability to stop time and capture it visually. We can probably live with this. Can you see the visuals? Okay.
Sorry, it should be full screen, but
yeah, okay.
So we're just going to live with this.
If you have been reading recently about Muybridge in the Times, there's a new book by a very fine writer called Edward Ball called The Inventor and the Tycoon, which is a kind of nonfiction turf that I'm working, although I've been very liberal with my improvs and lies on some level. And before that, 3 or 4 years before that, is a wonderful book by someone called Rebecca Solnit, S-O-L-N-I-T, called River of Shadows, which is really a great book about Muybridge, very intelligent about what he's trying to do in his work. It's a sort of an intellectual history. So in the last decade, anyhow, there have been 3 books on Muybridge. And of course, a lot of painters were fascinated by him, including Bacon and many others. But we'll talk about painting a little little later. Okay, I am going to read from the book. I have to give you a little background. I'm not going to give you a lot, but the book opens with a stagecoach robbery. It opens as a Western, which it is on some level, and Muybridge, Eadweard Muybridge, he was a very strange character. He had many, many names, one of which was Muybridge. He was born Muggeridge in Kingston on the Thames in England. Another English chap. But he messed around with his name a lot. He called himself Helios the Sun, and settled finally on Eadweard, E-A-D-W-E-A-R-D, which is very weird. Hi, Stephen. Hi, Susan. Muybridge. Eadweard was a great Saxon king, so it was a little great inflation, I would say, by nominally great inflation. Anyhow, there's her daughter Anna, too. Hey, hi, sweetie. So, stagecoach robbery is underway, and our struggling photographer, who has only been able to shoot dead people or bridges or landscapes, tries to take a photograph of the robbery in order to get in well, in order to advance his fantasy about working for the Central Pacific Railroad, which is the railroad which is being built west to east from Sacramento to some unknown point where it's supposed to join up with the Union Pacific Railroad and create the Transcontinental Railroad, which is an attempt to pull the United States together after the Civil War. The legislation actually starts in 1863. Anyhow, he's got a problem trying to take this shot, and the book's M.O., its profile, is really about the camera from almost total immobility to the invention of the motion picture projector. And Muybridge, of course, does invent a motion picture projector. So, moments captured. There are two people inside the stagecoach, one of whom is a guy who works for the Central Pacific, and the other of whom is a beautiful woman whose name is Holly Hughes, and who is a dancer. And Muybridge knows that from the outside because the bad guys, the bandits, demand the weapons that are in the stagecoach, and two pistols are thrown out of the windows. One is obviously a guy's gun, and the other is a small Smith & Wesson, very dainty but also lethal. Let me just get this book in the right place, yeah. Just then, he caught her slow, deliberate movement. Instantly, 4 guns were trained on her. Still, she kept gradually emerging from the coach, holding empty hands obligingly out in front where all could see. With unhurried calm, the woman turned her back on the outlaws, poised a costly calfskin boot on the iron step below the driver's seat, and started to hoist herself up. "Where you think you're going, lady?" She froze halfway up the side of the coach, holding herself with surprising ease. Stronger than she looks, Muybridge thought. The lovely face pivoted toward the leader, whose pistol remained aimed at her head. The guard is bleeding to death. Blood's pouring into the coach. Toe pointed, right knee bent, her leg drew a precise arc upward as it reached for the highest foothold. The outlaw leader kept the gun leveled, his eyes glued on her, lust vying with appreciation of her calm courage. 42, 43, the bandits can't take their eyes off her either, he thought, and continued his silent countdown. 44, 45. On top now, she stripped off her kerchief and efficiently tore it lengthwise. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'll live." The guard's voice was barely audible. "Not if I don't tie off this wound." With each heartbeat, blood arched up over the guard, spraying the seat. She improvised a tourniquet, applied pressure. The guard gasped, a drawn-out gurgling sound that made Muybridge worry that the poor man might drown on his own blood. The red arch diminished. As the woman increased pressure on his chest, the guard's knees slowly, as though by themselves, came up to his chin. He tried to squirm free, but she bore down on the tourniquet, applying pressure until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. So that's the first little excerpt. Where are we, Bob? That's his camera, or something very much like it. Can I move this forward? Here we go.
We don't have previews.
This is Thomas Eakins, a detail from a great painting by Thomas Eakins, and it's there just to suggest that a lot of 19th century painters were interested in trying to incorporate motion into their paintings. It's just an illustration which we'll get back to a little later. I have fictionally put Muybridge to work for Matthew Brady, the great Civil War photographer. It's another live Seidman's, but this is a picture that Brady took on the battlefield, or one of his assistants. He had a lot of assistants. Bob, let's see the next one. This is an extraordinary photograph. If you notice that the chaos of the battlefield is gone, and now we have 19 bodies posed in an arc leading to the background. They did that. Why? Because they were trying to create propaganda for the North, for the Union cause. And this was a brilliantly arranged, quite horrible photograph of what you could do. Did anyone see the Faking It show at the Metropolitan? Well, photography was once described very naively as a record of reality. Well, you know, from the beginning, photographers were messing around with the process, doing all sorts of things. We can't go into it now, but you get the idea. This photograph could not be printed at the time that Brady took it, but they would send these photographs north, and Frank Leslie's Weekly and Harper's Magazine would make woodblocks out of these things, and it was great for artists because it gave you a gig. Anyhow, that's why it's there. What comes next? We'll wait on that. Just enjoy it. Okay, the next scene is a scene. Muybridge and Holly Hughes have just met each other. Let me see. Oh, and in order to stay in shape, he set up an oar lock on the side of the Conestoga wagon, so he works out every morning or every morning he can get his butt into gear. They've just recently met, and there will be occasion to refer to bloomers. You know what they are, right? Muybridge is at the oar. He heard a distinctly feminine cough, spun his head around, and saw Holly Hughes emerge from behind a cottonwood. She walked toward the wagon, overtly assessing Muybridge's body. Glorious, isn't it? She paused, eyes locked on his torso for an unhurried moment. Then she slowly looked skyward. Her mocking eyes returned to Muybridge's stomach and chest as she asked, "Mind if I study your stroke?" Maybe. It was hard to catch his breath. "Just a few more pulls, please." Against his better judgment, Eadweard took a perfunctory pull at the oar. "Stronger," she commanded, leaning down over him. His mouth tasted like a sewer. Muscles felt shredded. Throbbing tissue twitched and shivered in places where he didn't know muscle existed. He pulled once, twice, a shuddering third time as she observed. She did not comment that his back was too curled to achieve maximum reach and power, that his feet were more than the optimal 3 inches apart, and worse, not truly parallel. With his feet positioned like that, his knees would never open up correctly and give his stroke the power he sought. Bemused, she thought, perhaps there'll be time for refinements another day. The fourth time Muybridge leaned into his pull, she reached out and placed a hand on his bare stomach. Under cool fingers, the muscles contracted. He stopped, stared up into her all-absorbing eyes. Her parted lips waited only inches away. Of course, it's a contraction exercise. The lilting voice sounded professional, his volunteer sculling coach. I generally suggest stretching as a compliment, especially for a man of your age and physique. Physique! Muybridge prided himself on taking care of his body. A smiling Holly Hughes quickly stripped off her navy skirt and emerged in scarlet bloomers. Astonished, he examined the baggy trousers which were tightly gathered around her ankles. Edward recoiled slightly. He hated seeing this gorgeous woman dressed in those ungainly, hideous bloomers. Let me demonstrate. I'm glad you're enjoying this. One of the great reviews of this said, who's enjoying it more, the writer or us? I really like that. She pointed her feet in opposite directions. Then Holly Hughes somehow managed to firmly flatten both heels on the ground. While this first position looked difficult, the next appeared physiologically impossible. Her spine undulated itself into a rippling S-wave, each vertebra as graceful and flexible as those of a swan's neck. Miss Holly Hughes appeared more fluidly hinged than other human beings. The idea is to generate tensile strength. Not knowing what to say, Muybridge laughed mirthlessly. Tensile? I guarantee you it will create real strength. I'm strong enough. He dismounted from the wagon. If he shook himself like a dog, he could have sprayed her with sweat. You say you're strong enough? She taunted him. Would you care to wrestle? The eyes, that face, the moist parted lips, everything seemed to send another message. I'd love to, Miss Hughes, but we've only just met. I am serious, and I'm not accustomed to wrestling with a woman. Afraid? Oh my, you're terrified of me. Her gray-green eyes blazed in mocking challenge. Muybridge realized he'd seen the same vicious spark in a boxer's eyes. Yet there she stood, a feminine ideal misshapen by those masculine trousers. Muybridge determined to end the nonsense, but suppose I, defiantly, she stuck out her formidable joy, I injure you. That's possible, you know. How can a self-respecting man wrestle with a woman? Where would I grab hold? Where can I lay my hands, say? What happens if, before Muybridge finished, Holly Hughes took 2 running steps and dove? The photographer found himself on his back. She moved above him and, snatching an arm and levering it behind him, flipped Edward onto his stomach. Struggling to slip free, Muybridge swore not to hurt Holly, yet he had to strain and push and shove to wedge his body away from hers. It took exhausting, then almost frightening effort before her hands slid apart and he broke clear. Miss Hughes, Holly, please, can't we just standing now, Muybridge managed to keep her at arm's length until she dropped to one knee, scuttled around behind, slid up his back, and caught him in a full Nelson. He broke the grip by fiercely jerking his arms down, spun back to face her. Muybridge realized with dismay that this was a contest in earnest, a fight he couldn't win without hurting her, if he could actually win. He felt honor-bound to restrain himself even while embarrassment and frustration gnawed at him, uncertain why the hell they were wrestling in the first place. Holly fainted to her right, which made Muybridge lean that way. Then, like a practiced barroom fighter, she butted her head hard into his chest. It hurt like hell and sent him down again. She flopped alongside the photographer, slipped a leg under him, and then wrapped the other over his chest and locked his torso in a powerful scissors hold. Muybridge lay gathering strength for a long moment, not knowing if he should laugh or pound her with his fists. She had all these moves and strategies while he thrashed, a defenseless idiot at air. The woman's thighs were wrapped around his chest, a position he felt both ludicrous and seductive. In Muybridge's universe, things did not proceed this way. So that's the wrestling match. We're in a dance hall next in San Francisco that holds 324 people. It's just like the Milan, the beautiful Milan Opera House. There's a Frenchman in the audience who's an old friend of Holly's. And Muybridge it's working now for Leland Stanford, who is one of the big four of these cats that built the Central Pacific Railroad at the taxpayer expense for the most part. A huge boondoggle, but also a very important part of the attempt to reunite the United States. The legislation starts in 1863. In Congress, there are three possible routes: a central route, a northern route, and a southern route, which of course is politically not possible. The North would not have allowed that. And they chose the central route, which is actually fairly far north. But it meant huge congressional handouts. All of our major infrastructure is the product of government investment. Don't let anyone tell you anything else. The canals, the railroads, the highways, the airports, all this bullshit about government not working is ridiculous. It doesn't work as well as it should, we all know that. She does a dance which is called the transformation dance. This is for real. The dancers did this. Holly struck the first pose of her transformation dance, the country maid. She strolled and sashayed and postured innocently until she worked her way back to stage right. The violinist pulled on the barely visible cord, and the first layer of costume was whisked from her body. The audience audibly inhaled its surprise, while before their eyes, Holly Hughes became a Mexican señorita. She danced a tarantella, her feet a moving blur, her body angled back so steeply it seemed that she would topple over. Then the string attached to her costumes peeled away another layer, and instantly she turned into a flamenco dancer, her boneless torso skewed and raked back, her head haughtily upright, eyes hooded, and heels loudly flashing. She rhythmically stomped her way through 3 minutes of the dance, the full skirt whipping and rising and trailing in erotic arabesque around her exposed thighs. The skirt seemingly as animated as the fan she brandished thrillingly above her head. So she dances beautifully, and they go nuts. Thank you very much when she's done. I want you to understand that my performance tonight would not have been possible for most women in the audience. The assembled quiet gradually cast adrift by this statement. Not because of the training I've been fortunate to have, nor because of any talent I might possess. Muybridge's mind plunged ahead, but he could not read Holly's direction here, which made him supremely nervous. Tonight, in lieu of an encore, my friends, I'd like to say a few words about dress reform for women. Holly Hughes had transported the audience, and for the moment, the sense memory of her artful loveliness shielded her. Holly parted the curtain and dragged a slate easel onto the apron. On it, Muybridge and 323 other spectators recognized a large drawing of a corset. His impulse was to laugh and cry at the same time. As I said, a word about dress reform and the corset. Muybridge detected a slight tremor in her voice as she chopped the word in two, meaning, he guessed, that she too was nervous about what was to follow. At the sight of the drawing, the audience had quieted. At the word corset, onlookers hushed. Few of the fashionable women or men in the opera house had ever uttered the word in public. In San Francisco in 1868, such a pronouncement was an insolent vulgarity, though each woman seated in the theater was tautly encircled by the self-same garment. And earlier that evening, each had voluntarily gone through the tedious process of self-encasement, stuffing their torsos into an intricate array of buckles and ties and hoops of bone and steel. Nature consecrated the shrines of our bodies, but in our time, fashion is destroying them. Corsets, once again, she sliced the word into two cringe-evoking syllables. Literally cripple and even murder women, for these devices deprive us of the natural muscle tone necessary for life, indispensable for childbearing. This is an outrage. Muybridge did not have to turn to recognize Leland Stanford's shout. The governor was livid. He felt deeply insulted. He grasped his wife's hand, and if he could have, he would have stopped up her ears. He judged Miss Hughes's outspokenness a threat to decency, a challenge to the rules by which he and the community abided. If only she had been content to remain quiet, to woo with her beauty and talent. Muybridge watched in impotent anguish, his eyes locked on his love. At the same time, the photographer suspected that the governor's eyes were fixed on him. Edward thought, in other eras, Holly would have self-righteously gone to the stake for her vision, along with the other so-called witches. On stage, Holly Hughes pointed to the white chalk drawing on the slate as confidently as a school teacher instructing pupils about the times table. This is a typical corset, which I dare say most, if not all, of the women seated here tonight are wearing on their persons. In front of Holly, over 300 men and women sat in pained silence, as yet unwilling to destroy the multi-stranded, fragile web of beauty she had woven for them. Her pointer traced the hourglass shape of the undergarment, moving inexorably down toward the upper thighs. As all women know, a sibilant hiss, startlingly loud in the silence, erupted. A swelling wave of discontent swept through the house as people grumbled and murmured and shifted in their seats. The corset has its own tight waist. The pointer limed the layers of the midriff. Underneath, we pile on what we prudishly refer to as the lower garments. Each of these has its own perverse binding. Someone roared, "Stop this!" Another plaintively gasped out, "Please." From isolated spots around the hall, booing and hissing erupted. Muybridge tensely gripped the arms of his seat as though trying to hold back the rising flood of indignation. "Disgusting," the first voice again. "You must stop this, now." The large man in the front row leaped up, turned, and addressed the entire house. "Kindly allow Miss Hughes to finish." The opulent French accent filled the hall. Stunned by his outburst, the opera house stilled. Muybridge examined the foreigner, who insouciantly sank back into his seat and stretched his long legs into the aisle. On stage, Holly took advantage of Fauconnier's temerity, understanding she had only a brief interlude. Usually, 12 to 16 layers of cloth gird the abdominal muscles, our God-given muscles, those muscles indispensable to breathing, to walking upright, to the sacred act of giving birth. In the gaslight, Holly's face assumed an aura not unlike the illumination surrounding the head of a New Testament saint. Holly was fulfilling her destiny and sealing her fate in provincial San Francisco. Scandalous, filth, obscene, derisive shouts showered down like an artillery barrage, landing closer and closer to its target. Muybridge spun around to identify her accusers, but voices were everywhere. Meanwhile, Holly stood defiantly on the apron, a strained smile cramping her generous mouth. A rain of programs hit the stage. A half-dozen of those wretched effigies of Holly Hughes scattered at her feet. So that's her reception in SF. I'm going to skip the trotting horse because I don't want to push the time. So there's a whole thing when he does finally get the 12 pictures of the horse trotting. And this is a, can you go back, Bob? Anyone know whose painting that is? Barbara.
It's the Italian
Bala. Yeah. One of the things that got me interested in this issue was this question about how you incorporate motion into pictures. Lautrec, Degas, Akins in the United States, but one of a very fine painter is here along with many other friends, Stephen. We've just had a conversation about this. Anyhow, this is Bala in the early 20th century doing a very funny, I'm sorry the resolution of this isn't better, but it's a wonderful painting. You see the dachshund with all its all its legs going and its tail moving, and also the, I believe, woman who's walking the dachshund is in, you know, she's got her feet going and her flounces of her skirt are bouncing around. Anyhow, we know that Muybridge, this is not a live Seidman, we know that Muybridge took those photographs of the trotting horse. Let me see if there's anything that we really need there. All right, so one of my fiction, oh, there we go. There it is. Sort of. I mean, this was later in Philadelphia, but the horse is trotting on its feet, though its hooves do leave the ground at one point in the sequence. And there was a big bet, at least fictionally, a big bet that Stanford laid on the fact that he was a horse trainer. You know where Stanford University is? Stanford University is on the site of the horse farm. And he was a great trainer of horses, and not him, but he was very interested in horse flesh, both flat racing and harness racing. The first photographs of the trotting horse are, of course, harness racing because they're slower. And Muybridge worked out this 12-camera mechanism to catch this with, among other things, you see those parallel lines on the back wall? They measure the distance of the hooves off the track. That's very important because in order to prove that, in fact, the horse's forelegs did leave the ground when it trotted, you had to have evidence, and this was evidence. And all the horse training before that was much less effective because they didn't know how the hell the horse moved. And of course, this simple, horribly difficult experiment, which involves, among other things, how do you trigger 12 cameras in sequence? Well, there's a great engineer with the Central Pacific whose name is Samuel Montague, and he said, I can't do it, but anyhow, electromagnets, so that's how they do it. Okay, I put Muybridge up in the Sierra Nevada with the Central Pacific, and here we are. In the worst, it's 1868, and they have the worst winter in recorded history. It snows like crazy, so they built ice towers, and they actually had a settlement which was below grade because they had to cut down through the ice, and it's horrible. And these guys, a lot of Chinese workers and some Irish workers, are outside all day, and all sorts of fingers fall off, and frostbite takes over, and it's just a totally horrible working experience, like much industrial experience in the 19th century. But they have this cause to rebind the United States to get those steel rails to join from St. Louis to Sacramento. You see the back cover of the book? I love this shot. And many of the workers, as I said, are Chinese. I have to use the word coolie because it was used. If anyone's offended, I am terribly sorry. And the others also a scene which I won't read on the cliff with guys clambering. There weren't any women working on it, although they had a whole brigade of Chinese prostitutes who were available. And they had to drill through. The Sierra Nevada route was, everyone assumed it would not be as difficult as the east to west route, but in fact, because of the steepness of the Sierras, they had to drill through granite, which was almost impossible. And the longest tunnel at that time, they drilled a quarter-of-a-mile tunnel. That's the scene. We'll get to the scene. And that's the stereoscopic shot. You would have seen that through. Anyhow, it was very rough, and they were developing at that point. They used black powder for most of the blasting, but late in this, nitroglycerin is introduced. We'll have a little nitroglycerin. The guys have gone on strike. The Chinese workers have said enough, and their foreman will speak. Min Yi was rail thin with an unmanageable wispy gray beard that shot off in all directions, a tattered rattan hat was jauntily slung on his back. He had sad, evasive eyes. Muybridge couldn't help noticing the foreman's hands, braided with wiry veins the color of annealed metal. The top two joints of the right index finger were gone, leaving shiny snakeskin-like scar tissue on the stump. Min-Yi spoke. The translator relayed the message to the white men. 3 good men killed last week in tunnel. 1 man fall and dead now. We no use new bombs. Min-Yi had positioned himself a step in front of the coolies, with the others pressed together behind him, barely an inch separating man from man. Tell them this clearly. Go back to work. Montague's rasping voice bounced off the granite, boomed back down the tunnel, making the air itself quaver. The silence and the immobility of the Chinese caught the attention of others at their headlong labor. Men swinging ringing hammers, men dragging top-heavy handcarts along the rails, men hefting rock ballast between the rails onto the right-of-way. They, too, halted. The entire workforce stood idle, hanging on the outcome of the debate. Samuel Montague's eyes did not leave Min-Yi, I'll say it one final time, back to work. No one stirred. Muybridge noticed that the tunnel workers, Irish, Chinese, all of them, were a uniform gray, as though they'd been all dipped whole into granite dust. Samuel Montague gingerly produced a small vial from his waistcoat. In it, an oily yellow liquid, the nitro itself. Terrified, the Chinese workers drew back as one body. Min-Yi stood his ground. The new procedure dictated that no one but the designated explosive expert handle the nitroglycerin, which had been introduced only weeks before. Orders commanded every single worker to vacate the tunnel whenever the explosive was to be used. After all, nitro is 5 times more powerful than the deadly black powder. By the way, the black powder was used in those 2 awful bombs in Boston, and much more unstable. So unstable that they cushioned it in transport, swathing it in blankets, and brought the substance into the tunnel only when they were ready to blast. With each man watching as though his life depended on it, slowly, with great patience, Samuel Montague placed his index finger up against the vial's opening and tenderly poured the explosive substance toward the lip. Steadying himself, the engineer pulled his finger back from the lip, holding it up like a cautionary note. It was coated with the yellow liquid. The laborers squeezed together more tightly, as though hoping as a group to survive whatever terror the tunnel man proposed for them. The chief engineer took 2 rapid steps at the coolies, then sharply flicked his finger at the granite wall. The explosion startled everyone. Rock shifted. A few loose, smaller pebbles rattled down as the wall, the floor, the entire cave rumbled and trembled crazily, then gradually settled back. If any men, any single one of you, refuse to work, I'll bring the entire goddamn mountain down on your heads. Shaking his explosive index finger, Montague threateningly jabbed at the rock ceiling. Say that in Chinese. They get back to work. It snowed a lot. It snowed a lot. It snowed a lot. So the next scene, oh wait, it's my favorite lady in the 19th century. That painting is called American Progress. I'll have to shout. It's very hard to see. Can we turn the light off just for a second? Thank you. Sorry to bother you. You read it obviously from right to left, from east to west. There's a train. So that's and urban stuff going on back there. On the upper right, ships and all the civilization. And then we have some farmers tilling the ground. I'm sorry, the resolution's so lousy. The stagecoach couldn't resist that. Guys look like they might be prospectors or maybe hunters, a pioneer family. Here are the poor Native Americans moving off forever, basically. And that woman is called American Progress. Not surprisingly, she has a Bible in her right arm. And anybody see what she has in her, through her left hand? We can turn it back on. Telegraph paper. It's brilliant. It's brilliant and altogether perverse at the same time. That's American Progress. So it snows a lot. 100 yards ahead of the rail layers, a 6-man team of Chinese shovelers attacked a 30-foot drift. The men were delicately tunneling into the snow when above the retaining wall to their right there came a low warning sound. A mere split second later, with a deepening growl and rumble like magic, the volume thunderously amplified, a blurred white wall plummeted down toward the toiling figures. The avalanche drove white upon swirling white without edge or limit. Like a swift sensate beast sounding a roar, the indistinct swirling snow leaped down upon the men. Muybridge and scores of others watched as the terrified figures reacted. Tossing away their shovels, 3 managed to scramble out of danger. The other 3 took a panicked step or 2 before they were seized and tossed and whirled away by the roaring white cliff, while picturesque rippling traceries danced at the edges of the onrushing cloud. The 3 escapees huddled together, shivering fearfully. An Irish foreman sprinted over and hugged them as though they were his sons. Others crowded up. A Chinese lad offered mugs of tea, while the hundreds of eyes anxiously scanned the slope below for signs of life. Suddenly, Muybridge flung himself down the mountain, sliding on the unstable snow. He slid and tumbled and belly-flopped headlong down the precipice, moving with odd, floundering motions like a fish struggling on a line. Out of control, careening down. For some absurd, unfathomable reason, Muybridge wanted to save 1 life. In the past month and a half, he'd witnessed too many men die because a fuse had been snipped a half-inch short, die because the charge had a few extra grains of black powder, die because of flying rock shards or a frayed strand of rope, or because a foot slipped or arms were too fatigued to haul up fast enough. He was sick and tired of seeing men die before his eyes, bone-tired and heart-sore of the surreptitious photos of the unmoving dead. As Central Pacific workers looked on, Eadweard slid and finally stopped where he thought he'd seen 1 man go under. He dug frantically with gloved hands in the loose top snow. Above him, the mountain rumbled and hacked and threateningly cleared its throat. Mere yards away on the far side of him, tons of snow cascaded down. But Muybridge was oblivious. They watched the photographer dig with fiery, tingling hands, scraping at the white powder until his fingers burst through the leather gloves. His hands were stiff and raw and bloody when he hit something. Flesh. More frantic scrapings with his freezing fingers, and he scratched at the beginnings of a leg. The coolie's pants had been ripped away from the calf, which felt warm and cold simultaneously, the pale-skinned fish-like clammy on this spring-like afternoon. Eadweard dug anxiously, hoping the man was still alive, his torn hands leaking red traces on the snow. The avalanche had flipped the worker upside down so that Muybridge thought if he dug fast enough, the poor bastard might still have a chance. He could sense the crowd above staring at him, a madman. He couldn't yell for help because the least noise might set off another slide, and besides, he wasn't sure that anyone would come to his aid. He scratched and dug and tore at the snow with mindless frenzy until 2 Chinese workers slid down the hill on their backs and gently pulled Muybridge away. He never understood what one of the Chinese men said to him, but the pain and fear in his voice penetrated. Together, the men slowly freed the dead worker from the snow. And now the last thing. Is that enough? Yeah, okay. That's fine. That's fine. we want some time to talk, and I'm such a ham. So, thank you.
Oh, there it comes.
Okay. Yes.
So the first question, for those of you who don't know Bob's first extraordinary novel, One Smart Indian, the question is, which is also about the American West. It's a. I'm not going to give the plot away or tell you much about it, except that it's really the story of Moses. It's the story of an Indian boy captured and raised by a white family who goes back to his people. But how does a non-Indian boy from a Philadelphia suburb make the American West really his life work?
It's funny, Judith and I we had dinner recently, and I must say that I want to thank Judith publicly. I had a problem with the ending of the novel, and Judith, I'm not going to tell you what she said, but she thought that I'd insufficiently motivated the ending, and I think I owe you a great debt of gratitude for making me work a little harder and think a little harder. So you have to read the novel, and then we can discuss what Judith's input was. The Why the West. All right, this is going to sound really weird, but when I was a little boy, I loved cowboys and Indians. And in fact, there is a photograph of me, which we have, Patty and I and the kids, we have somewhere, of me dressed up in a cowboy outfit. It's not just being dressed up in a cowboy outfit. I have that hat, I have the gun belt, I have the chaps, I have boots, but I've got this expression on my face that I really think I'm a bloody cowboy. I really think I'm there. And this is not, of course, unique to me. All kids, many kids, most kids, fortunately have this ability to transport themselves. That image is still with me. The first book, as Judith said, is about a Cheyenne Indian child who was raised as a Cheyenne, part 1, re-educated as a kind of pre-Gandhi figure, part 3, and part 2, and part 3 is screw the white man. We're going to get some vengeance for all this imposition.
But I want to push this a little bit because yes, sure. Every kid does want to be every little boy. I was a cowgirl. I had a little cowgirl outfit, but I sort of, when I put it aside, outgrew it. I sort of outgrew that fantasy. But you also then gave up the cowboy hat and took on an Indian persona, and so there's, but the West. I wanted to ask you sort of a leading question, because listening to the presentation, rereading the book, there was a sentence that leapt out. You were talking about Muybridge after a certain point. I won't do a spoiler thing, but he said, life did not stand still. And in a way, it seems to me that everything, the notion of progress, of the West, of the pushing forward of everything, and of the invention of a way of capturing motion, it's very much of a picture.
Yes. One thing about the Indian book, it's really about our brand of internal colonialism. Cut to me going as a student to England and looking at our culture from the outside. I think that's one of the reasons I was able to write the One Smart Indian. This question of capturing movement, life is about movement. And one of the, as I said, the MO of the book is the camera from total immobility to the invention of the motion picture projector. That's incredibly important. And it's also a technological romance. Muybridge falls in love with a beautiful dancer. He falls in love with a beautiful woman, and he wants to have pictures of her, memories of her. He wants to be able to capture her animation, not her frozen. And therefore it's sort of the technology of the trotting horse and the technology of the development of this technology, this question of how you do represent a reality that surrounds us. As I move my hand, as Judith speaks, imagine the frustration of not being able to describe that. And also, even if you can describe it, even if you can remember it briefly, you can't replicate it. So the idea of replication of movement is extraordinary. Did that answer something of the question? Yeah.
No, definitely. It was also, I thought, very ironic that American Progress, the sort of blonde nymph, is not wearing a corset.
That's true. That's true. It may have been before Victorian Victorian era. I can't remember what the date of that is.
Okay. Now, I want to take up a big kind of controversial question with you. You were talking about, we were talking about photography and the lie of realism. And it's controversial that you've taken a biographical, a living character and a piece of history, and in a way, as a photograph might, re-represented it, airbrushed parts you didn't like, added others, you photoshopped it. You
Yes.
sort of photoshopped the story of Muybridge. So I wondered if you would talk about that process.
Well, putting Muybridge, I tried to put Muybridge together with certain historical events. As I said to you, I fessed up about the Matthew Brady. I put him with Brady because he was around then. Why not have him photograph the Civil War, do part of that? He was in Palo Alto and working with Stanford on the horse experiment, on the trotting horse and then the galloping horse experiment, so that seemed fairly honest. He was not involved in the Transcontinental Railroad business, but he could have been. And it seemed to me, one of the conceits of the book, Judith and All, is that he wants to create a portrait of the United States, of all of the U.S. And of course, and in fact, he and several other great 19th century photographers were doing that, was part of their project. So, you know, it seemed to me natural and permissible if I simply said, hey, this is a fiction. I also wanted him to fall in love with a very dynamic female. I wanted him to fall in love with a woman who was at least as strong as he was. And I think Holly is at least as strong as he is. She has also the advantage and perhaps the disadvantage of being independently wealthy. Muybridge is a drone who's got to earn his living, so Holly can pretty much give the conventional world the thing.
Does she have a historical model?
No, none. None except that, retrospectively, maybe a little Isadora Duncan mixed in, but I don't know much about Duncan's life, so I certainly wasn't thinking specifically of any female, but I was of any historical female. But I was thinking of a very strong woman. I mean, Judith just did a review, very good review in the New Yorker of a book about Margaret Fuller, who didn't have Holly's beauty, but she certainly was very interested in Eros.
Yes. A Greek theater director once, this fits in with what we were saying about movement, that he said, in any contest among the gods, Eros will always win because Eros is the principle of change.
Yeah,
and so that sort of
great.
that is completely fits in with your notion of the thrust of Eros in this story, I think. But going back to the notion of merging biography and history, did you have any models for that? I mean, what were your...
Well, I think all novels are fictional. I couldn't possibly compare this novel to War and Peace, but Tolstoy gets into the head of both the great Russian general Kutuzov, and it's Napoleon said he wasn't there. He didn't have any knowledge of this, but it seemed to me that there are wonderful models. And, you know, Hilary Mantel in the first book, in Wolf Hall, which Peter, another R. Peter, in the back suggested I read. Everybody who writes historical fiction, everyone who writes fiction is writing historical fiction. It's all retrospective. There's nobody writes fiction currently. It can't be done. You've got to, you can write about contemporary events and you can have contemporary language, but it's, you know, the act of writing it takes time. So I can't think specifically of anyone, but I do love the best of that genre, so I've rubbed up against it for a very long time. Stendhal writes great historical fiction, and your man Flaubert doesn't do badly either. So.
But I think the Stendhal example is good because it has the panorama. I mean, it's a kind of horizontal panorama.
Yes.
Very much so, rather than a sort of more dense or round or impacted.
I like to think that my work, to the extent that it exists, I did a big novel with the Indian book and a much smaller, much more focused novel with the Bucks County Idol. And the one we just did, Moments Captured, I hope will be followed by a very focused novel, which is called The All-American Game, about, again, a Native American, but set contemporaneously.
Well, let's have some questions from, you really have to ask questions, because it's good, because then and the first person never wants to go, and then there's silence, but then someone starts. Oh, okay.
Oh, great.
Good. Oh, you can ask Bobby, and you can...
You can ask Bobby, you can ask Judith, you can ask my wife, my children, anything.
Break the ice.
Well,
Fletcher.
You know, there are people that follow these events and ask the same question each time. Hecklers.
That's not people. That's person.
But your work in documentary filmmaking based in reality is a huge job of scholarship and fact finding, and of course this book, which is fiction, to just say a little about the the fact finding here and like that.
Well, I think the more you lie and cheat, the more you have to be able to defend yourself against the attacks, not of the veracity of Muybridge's wife, or the fact that he goes to work for Stanford and for the Central Pacific and actually didn't do it. But all that stuff seemed to me such rich terrain that, of course, I read a lot and thought a lot about what was going on with the Central Pacific or with Brady. I mean, I find that I noticed there was quite almost an audible intake of breath when I said those 19 bodies were arranged. That sort of thing gives you a perspective on what history is about, all the wonderfully organized lies, and lots of truths too. I had another thought about that.
I have a question. I want to follow up on that.
Yeah.
When you were doing your research about, I presume you read a lot of this too, about feminism in that period in the West. What came up?
That was the hardest section to write. It's hard enough for a guy to do a woman or women. There's another character I like very much, a female in it, who happens to be a hooker, but a very wonderful, wonderful woman of the night. What I found, if you read, one of the great takes on feminism in the 19th century is Henry James' The Bostonians. There's also a great book by George Gissing called The Odd Women. Almost all the pamphlets and speeches were my biggest problem because they're so bloody preachy. They're not very good, and they make you squirm, not because of the content, but because of the language. I tried desperately to make Holly not preachy, even though she's working that turf. So stylistically, it's a real challenge. Mm-hmm. Of course, I read lots of feminists, but after a while, 19th century feminists, after a while, they start to sound the same, because it's a problem of vocabulary. It's really hard. Did anyone see that wonderful documentary series, 3-part series on the women's movement? Did you like it, Mickey?
I did.
I thought it was fabulous. And just to pick one example, Gloria Steinem has an amazing way to speaking and thinking and making sense, common sense out of the stupidities that surround us every day. The strength of what I was trying to do, you'll have to determine how well I did it, is that Holly tries to speak common sense. Of course, it is a very, very bad idea. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's something imposed. And women, as you know, and Bob showed in the slides, women participated in this absurdity as well.
Well, the women surely in the hall that evening, going to a dance recital in San Francisco, would have had corsets, but the pioneer women probably could not have. They couldn't have done their work in a corset.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what happened? It's so interesting. Judith's absolutely right about it. Think about the kind of tedium, but also a sort of liberation when you're on the trail and when you're settling into your new homestead. It's backbreaking work, but a lot of the rules that applied, a lot of the strictures that applied in urban settings were up for grabs. You couldn't impose that kind of thing, you know. Communities invented their own rules, I think, in those days. And there are lots of now, there's Annie Oakley, you know, there are lots of feminist, Western feminists. Yeah, Belle Starr. Yeah. There are lots of feminist heroines, heroes, whatever the gender of that is.
So questions?
Question?
Yes?
So Bob,
Is this easy?
Andre.
Here,
it
here.
seems like writing about the clashing against the society and writing about the overcoming the problems, the general liberalization process. Mm-hmm. Is that easier than writing about the original reification? Is it that it's longer? Why is that absent?
I don't know. I guess I'm attracted to dramatic events, so I try to dramatize this stuff. It's a good question. I don't think I have an answer, Andre. I just don't. I think, you know, it's like looking at a painting and say, why did Joan Mitchell use that red? You know, there's a rational process, and then there's another photograph copy, right? There's something else that takes over. Also, every fiction or every work of art, if this is a work, every work has a momentum, and once you're into the momentum of it, your choices become much more reduced, right? Mm-hmm. Judith wrote a brilliant book about Isaac Dinesen. I mean, it's a great book. And the further you go along, the less options you have. And intellectually, I get a lot of things to play with in this book, but at a certain point, the characters, if they're doing it, if they're with you, you know, if you're really getting some momentum, they take over in part. I mean, they aren't writing it for you.
Well, the thing in a biography is you have no options.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that's part of the appeal of writing, of doing this, of the freedom of creating options. It's sort of like blasting options out of the rock of history in some way.
Right.
I mean, you have options in the writing.
Thanks, Giorgio. Ciao.
Another question before we go eat?
You're going to let me? No more? Yes, Bill.
Do you want one?
It's okay.
He's got a big voice.
You've worked in film.
Yes. We worked together.
Books.
Yes.
It's true. In both cases, and in this book, you're very concerned with movement, capturing movement.
Yes.
Now you're writing about a photographer in this book. I want to know if you felt hemmed in at all. Why not make a film about him instead? And actually, you know, it makes plenty of sense to me.
We're going to put the 30 million, 40 million together, Bill?
Well, it's cheaper, but you know what? I mean, what I imagine is this, because I just listened to what you read.
Right.
And what you read appeals to all the senses. And I could see it. It moved. I could smell it because you let me smell it. You feel hemmed in at all?
No, not at all. I feel liberated.
Are you sorry you don't have a camera? Or in fact, do you have a camera?
It's time for someone to pick up the camera and do it, but I really wanted it in words. I mean, it's about language, too. And one of the issues, I was just talking to someone about this, about trying to make the language of a period live. You have certain constraints. This is hemming in, but it's also a liberation. I wanted the idiom to be consistent with the 19th century, no 20th century slang, no. I mean, I'm sure there are a few mistakes in it. I don't doubt that at all. I know there's an anatomical part that gets mentioned in one of the lovemaking scenes, that someone gave me beef about. That's funny. That is funny. I didn't think of it. Anyhow, somebody rained on me about it. But no, I didn't feel rained in, oddly enough. Maybe that's how I get off internally. You know, I mean, it's this odd kind of process. I mean, you know, from what you do in film work.
What I'm really saying is I think you captured movement. Same way Muybridge did.
Well, thank you.
That is a great, oh yes,
Thank you.
it's a great
Thank
last
you.
line, but there's another
thank you,
question.
Bill. I'm
Wonderful.
appreciative. Yes, please. Susan.
Here. Having read the book, that was exactly my impression, but you did it on many levels. First, there's this railroad that's pulsing across the country, waiting to join up, and that sort of inexorable movement there, and then Muybridge trying to capture, and prove the point about the horses, feet not touching the ground, and then some very torrid love scenes that were speedy, so to speak. And so the whole novel had this sense of forward motion, which I thought was very impressive on all three levels.
Thank you so much. Well, the 19th century, you look back at it, it could be described as a history. I would never say progress. I wouldn't say evolution, but it does have movement. I hate the term evolution because it implies a teleology, as though we're getting somewhere, I think. I'm not at all sure we're getting anywhere. But, the conditions change, things move. We as sentient beings move and change and age and eventually, unfortunately, die. But anyhow, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Bill, both of you guys. Yes? Did I see a hand, Susan?
No, that was Susan's hand
Susan.
coming down.
Right.
If we don't have more questions, I think we will adjourn. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No. Just thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Coming.
You both.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Jessica and